Boardroom Bound, episode 115, Exploring the Evolution of Boardroom Diversity with Charlie Beasley.
There is clearly an underrepresentation globally of diverse talent at board level, and I think we are just really keen through this tracker to actually highlight kind of where we've got to, and not in a negative way, say, look, isn't that terrible, but it's also to highlight the opportunity to really lean in and make difference. And I'm a bit of an optimist. I kind of think, well, look how much we can still achieve.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Charlie Beasley. He is a consultant at Egon Zehnder, which is one of the 5 big executive search firms that all of you want to know more about. Charlie is someone who is a leader in their board practice, and he's also going to talk to us today about their Global Board Diversity Tracker. This is a biannual survey. It comes out every other year. They've been doing it for 16 years, which means they've done 8 of those. And this is the first year they've tracked not just gender, but also racial, ethnic, LGBTQ, different types of diversity metrics they're putting out there. We're seeing interesting results. We're finding different changes to their boardroom that are coming out there. Charlie's going to give us great insights, and especially as we think about how the world has changed in the last 2 years since this report has come out, the racial, ethnic, sexual orientation diversity means so much more to the boardroom discussion than ever before. Plus, Charlie's got great anecdotes and tips that you're going to want to have as you go through your board search career. Let's jump into the show. Charlie Beasley, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here, Alexander.
Well, for me, this is good fun because it is a small world after all. So here I am over in America, sitting near Boston, and your background growing up in Australia, and now you're working in London. So we are talking about the boardroom space, multinational companies. This is something that resonates all over the world. So glad to be hearing about what is going on today. And of course, you are working at probably one of the top 5 firms that everybody listening to the show wants to know about. Egon Zehnder is one of those names that we're all thinking like, gosh, if I could get someone like Charlie to have me on their radar, I would just be set. And it's not as simple as that. We'll talk about that today. But I would love to, if we just start the show by talking about your career beginnings, because you didn't come overnight to be working at Egon Zehnder, working with some of the biggest and most important companies in the world. So give us a bit of background.
Absolutely. So Egon Zehnder, as you mentioned, that we are one of the world's largest executive search and advisory firms, and we have quite a unique hiring model. We don't hire anyone who's ever done this work before. We're all late in life apprentices, and it usually happens in quite a strange way. Someone from Egon Zehnder asks you to join, and your first response is, gosh, who would want to be a headhunter? And then we start a long interview process and get indoctrinated, might be the way of describing it. But yes, I started my career as an antitrust lawyer. Sort of fell into a fabulous organisation, but then was hired into one of our clients to join their government relations team, and had a great couple of years there. But then there was still an itch to scratch moving overseas, so I took a role with a big global law firm, Linklaters. Mm-hmm. But that really confirmed that I really didn't like being a lawyer. It was quite helpful to do it in a different environment. I realised I was probably the wrong mix of laziness and anxiety in combination. So I was always always worried about getting it wrong, but never liked the actual legal work to get it right. And then an opportunity came up that kind of ultimately played to my strengths, which was the chief of staff to the global managing partner of the firm. And that gave me 5 years of helping run probably one of the largest and most premier law firms in the world, sort of doing everything from government relations to helping their executive run to being the right-hand guy on a plane for most of my life for 5 years. And it was in that context I came across Egon Zehnder. And really that was a lovely moment for me, because it sort of played to what matters, which is I love client service, I love really helping people, but fundamentally I'm really interested in people. And this job is all about, from my perspective, helping organisations, but particularly individuals, really craft out the next step in their career and really helping them fly. And having had a father who actually was a management consultant, he always would come home and talk about how he'd helped individuals. He didn't talk about how much money he made, but how much he'd helped them solve their problems. And ultimately, that's what I get to do every day at Egon Zehnder.
And we should give a little bit of context, because I imagine for someone, a new person to this show listening to it, it's like, okay, if someone like a Charlie knew about me, knew what a great candidate I was, they'd be able to take me out to the boards and the seats would open up because they're talking to organizations. But let's be clear, because it's the organizations that hire you. How does that sort of relationship work, even at just at a sort of 30,000 foot high level about finding a board candidate?
Yeah, absolutely. So we mandated by companies. So that will either be the chair or the company secretary or someone from the nominating committee approaches us, and that's usually because we have a long-standing relationship with large organisations. And they will say to us, we have this particular need, either immediately, or they'll be looking at succession planning, or they'll be looking at some other activities they're doing, and we are mandated to leverage our network and our research to go out and find the very best. We are always interested in cultivating and building our net relationships with exceptional individuals, but when the rubber hits the road, we are very much about working for the company, identify, assess, and then partner through a search process to help them find the very best. So, yes, you want to be on our books, but also we'll come and find you as soon as we have the right thing. So it's kind of a bit of a combination of the both.
Well, we had Russ Reynolds on the show many episodes ago, and he, of course, founded two of the big companies we tend to think about in this space. And I was asking him, like, personally, how do you think about, how you go out and find people? Do you want people to come to you? He goes, I don't need anybody to come to me. I'm going to go find somebody. That's our job. We're very good at doing that. We know exactly who to call, and they will give us the short list of people. And he was very confident about it because he'd clearly done it for a long period of time. So even though the world has changed so much from, say, when the industry first started, now that you've got LinkedIn and other resources right at the fingertips on your computer, at the end of the day, it's still about individual contact. And it's really important that you guys have your fingers on the pulse, which is why so many of the Egon Zehnder staff have come from so many different corners of not only the world of where they work, but different sorts of industries.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about research, but it's also about building long-term relationships, because ultimately we are often approaching candidates that actually aren't necessarily looking for their next board role or next opportunity, and actually it's sort of that. And so we have to know when is the right time, what is the right type of thing. So it's not quite as transactional as I think sometimes it can perceive. We actually, and particularly the Egon Zehnder model, where our entire compensation system and stuff is very different to the rest of the industry, I think we build up very long-term relationships so we know the right roles to approach people about. And the other thing I would say is there is a bit of a role for us ensuring that we're constantly out meeting great new people and high potential talent, particularly in the area of more diverse hiring, where I think actually we have a real responsibility to ensure that talent that may not be putting their hands up for things are also being thought about, but also thinking themselves that they could be potential board candidates, which obviously we can get onto, Alexander. So don't worry, we will find you, but don't be surprised. We often do just like getting to know people without a mandate in mind.
Of course, and I think the other big part of it is there's a short-term, long-term thinking, just like you said, filling a board seat now versus later. And I realize there are also different rules around the world about this. But if we take, say, a public company in America, generally they're not publicly posting somewhere that they're looking to fill a board seat for a variety of reasons. They don't want people to know that, and hence why they're encouraging people like you to help us find the right person in a very sort of confidential but yet sophisticated way. Yes, so don't be surprised if occasionally it comes across as a little bit cloak and dagger with non-disclosure agreements. It's often we have to have some quite hilarious conversations before we've entered into those kind of slightly more confidential chats where we say, so I need to talk to you about an opportunity in a sector that looks like this and feels like that without giving any details. And it can often feel a little bit existential and abstract sometimes till we get in the details. So I think trust, when someone approaches you about that, it's usually because it's interesting. And I guess I would also say when someone approaches you about that, even though it sounds a bit nebulous perhaps, is that always take those calls and always be helpful to someone like Charlie who reaches out to you, because it doesn't matter if you're a fit for that individual one today. When you're thinking about building a long-term relationship, that's a two-way street. You're not just saying, hey, Charlie, know about me and remember me. It's like, Charlie, what can I do for you? What can I open up in my network? It doesn't sound like that's a fit for me, but if you tell me a little bit more, let me see if I can think of a couple people for you. I imagine that's always a welcome response to the call as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people should not discount the power of human connection in just unlocking things, and I mean that in a really practical way. A lot of the role of a search firm is actually also calling out people and actually just asking what good looks like from their perspective and things like that. There's lots of ways to stay active in the mind of search firms without necessarily being a candidate. One is taking that call and actually offering up a couple of names and thoughts. Those, or offering an informal background reference on someone, that plays hugely in your favour in terms of ensuring that you're front of mind for things. It's also an opportunity for you to show how good you are. And I'll give you an example. If we're taking a reference on someone and the person giving is a fabulous reference giver, that is a really good sign, actually, in terms of the strength of their engagement, their level of curiosity around others and things like that. So there are lots of ways in a slightly more informal way to sort of show how good you are, but also those conversations with us that aren't necessarily going to be for the right role are really helpful in building that understanding of where we should be approaching you and what about. And just one final thing I should say is it's not uncommon for us to say, John or Jane, look, it's been great getting to know you. Would you mind letting us take maybe one or two informal references on you? Which is a really great way of building out our understanding of your strengths and weaknesses and brand in a way that actually also helps you, because you're then a pre-referenced candidate that can probably much more quickly end up in long lists and short lists for search. So it's always a delight when people take our calls, but hopefully it's also a way for you to get a little bit of practice in actually how you talk about your strengths and kind of where you want to go in your board career or executive career.
That's great context. And Charlie, I think that's almost the perfect segue, because you guys have your finger on the pulse of so much that's going on. And one way is you're sharing that information with what you're seeing with other people. For example, like the report that we're going to talk about today is your 2020 Global Board Diversity Track. I know this is a biennial report, so you've done this for 16 years. You've had 8 reports going on, and it's changed a lot within this last report cycle. So it'll be very exciting to talk about it. So traditionally, you've reported on gender, which has been very helpful, but now you've added racial, ethnic, LGBTQ. So there's so much more information to unpack in there. And even before we start to get in at the higher level, over, say, the 16 years of the report, what a board member who is qualified looks like has changed so much. Can we sort of talk about that, almost joking about what it used to be before versus what it might be now?
Yeah, Alexander, I think that's very true. I think you often heard that idea that diversity was CEOs from a different sector, and then gradually we've seen greater diversity from a functional perspective, and things like that. So we are seeing a broader concept of who's qualified to be on the board. But I think as our global board diversity tracker is sort of pulling out, is we are really starting to see, albeit we're still in the foothills in many ways, that broader concept of identity and experience joining the board. And that's something we're really excited about. I think there is clearly an underrepresentation globally of diverse talent at board level. And I think we are just really keen through this tracker to actually highlight kind of where we've got to. And not in a negative way, say, look, isn't that terrible? But it's also to highlight the opportunity to really lean in and make difference. And I'm a bit of an optimist. I kind of think, well, look how much we can still achieve. And maybe that's naive, but it's kind of the way I approach it. And I think it's one of the reasons that it's really good just to have the data out there, so there's a bit more of a shared understanding of what still needs to be done.
And it is really interesting when we think about the trajectory of diversity in the boardroom. It was originally the strongest push was for gender diversity. And that was something we could easily see in, say, a public company's annual report of what that was starting to look like. We can also see whether there's, say, racial diversity from the photos, but there's a lot you can't tell from some of that, of whether they're, a veteran, LGBTQ, disability, things like that, socioeconomic background someone might have come from. But all of that clearly can add interesting perspectives into the mix, the skills and values that someone brings. And my personal view is it's very hard to innovate if you don't have diversity of thought around the boardroom. So there's a lot of value someone can bring. And I know you've got some really interesting statistics that show some of this. Clearly, some countries are doing better than others overall. But maybe we can begin to dive into a bit of this and see some of the information that you're sharing in this year's report.
Yeah, Absolutely. And just a little bit of background about the report. I mean, this is based on the data that we've pulled together from about 1,700 companies, with sort of where the market cap is sort of significant, so more than 6 billion euros. And so it kind of covers about 44 countries. And I think, there is some positive news. We are seeing, so if we just start with gender diversity, because obviously that's kind of been a traditional focus. 89% of all large company boards in our report include at least one woman, but that is kind of not geographically consistent. So some countries are sort of not doing so well, where there's still many. I think there's about 25 countries from China to Brazil to Germany, which still are home to many companies that have no women on the boards. But then other countries like New Zealand, I think, that are sort of smashing it out of the park in terms of, I think, are at 46% or something. So it's very geographically specific in terms of the level of progress that's been made. I think one of our observations as a firm, though, is you do often see this, you are seeing the increase in gender diversity on boards where there are targets, and whether that be company targets or investor-led targets or things such as that has really helped drive this forward. But I suppose from our perspective, we think you're not really going to start seeing the institutional cultural change if you stop at just one female director or two. It's sort of you need more to actually
there's
start
a tipping
to get
point.
the benefit of the diversity.
Do you think of it as a tipping point, Charlie?
Well, I think it's just whether or not a tipping point. There is that idea, though, that actually, if you put it on one, it doesn't matter what element of diversity we're talking about, but if you make it all about that one person, you are putting a huge amount of burden on them to kind of represent all sorts of things, which actually in the query is whether or not you're actually going to be able to, can any one person do that on their own? And also to drive cultural change, you need wingmen and women around you, and actually you want people who are going to help generate that active discussion and debate that you get from having different perspectives. Just asking one person to do it, I think, is probably a little bit much.
I've talked to several female directors who talk about how the culture changes immediately when the first woman is put on the board, but then changes dramatically more as you see the second and third come along. Cheryl Batchelor, who's on the show, talked about, well, there's no more martinis during the lunch as soon as the first female is on the board, and the conversations begin to change. These are good things.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I think we're quite looking at is where you get real sort of the next elevation or the next step in that change is when you actually start to have those women or other diverse candidates actually take on the leadership roles on the board. So whether that be taking committee leadership roles or chair roles, because ultimately then they're starting to really shape the way the board is operating, they're starting to shape the way the board is built. And I think we're still very much, we've got a long way to go here. I mean, I think it's only about 2% of all board chairs are women, up from 1.5 in 2018, but you are seeing a lot more women sort of start to take board committee leadership roles, albeit it's about approaching sort of 28% now. But I think that's a demonstration of where you're going to start seeing more systematic institutional change in the kind of diversity of the board if you see more people taking on those leadership roles.
And so, Charlie, how do you feel about some countries have been very good about, say, legislating quotas, if we want to call it that, or you're starting to see in America, so some of the exchanges are saying we would like a board to have a minimum of, say, one woman versus one other diversity type candidate, whether racial, sexual orientation things. Do you feel like that's the best way for this to go in order to get diversity in the boardroom, or is the thought process it would be better if organizations could just handle it and push it forward themselves?
I think if we look at base principles, I think our view is it's all about a sense of commitment, a sense of mindset, and a sense of how we're going to drive progress. Whether that's done via quotas or targets is not something that we have a fixed view on. I think my personal view is targets are really helpful, largely because it's a little bit like us even putting out this tracker report. It actually gives a sense of the the performance versus opportunity. And in the absence of some kind of measurement, in the absence of some kind of aspiration, it's not a surprise that this kind of stuff falls down the wayside. I think one question I have is when you make it about quotas is there's always a risk that people feel like when the quota is hit, well, the job is done.
Right.
And I do wonder whether or not we're doing a disservice to people if they say, look, if we get to 30% of a particular type of a diversity on a board that we're done, because that's not what this is about. This is about continuing to challenge yourself to ensure that the board is representative, is diverse in its thinking, is inclusive in its approach, and ultimately that's not defined by whether or not you've got a certain number. Having said that, just to get enough momentum, I think targets are a really good idea.
And I know in your report you highlight, for example, we were talking about how female directors is an easy thing that's been tracked for a long time. I think it's 8 of the 18 countries in your report have quotas of the 18 that have met the tipping point of the average of having 3 or more female directors on the board. But when I step back and think about, so there was great progress over the last few years, some of it mandated, some just sort of pressure applied to organizations from shareholders and others wanting to see this. But also when I think about what we've gone through in the last year with the coronavirus crisis, it has really forced organizations to step back and say, do we have all of the skill sets we need on the board? And I think one example, and I'd be curious if you're hearing about this, is say chief HR officers are in such high demand now, people going, wow, we need to think about how we manage our talent so differently, and who are the right people to have in the room to be thinking about how we engage with our customers, with our staff, et cetera. And I imagine that is becoming a bit more of a door pushed open a bit to say, do we have all the people we need in the room? What could that look and feel like?
Very much so, particularly in the context of some of the really striking social issues that have come up in the last 12 months. There's been a real question about what kind, do we have people that really understand how to create great organisational culture? Do we have the right people that really understand some of the kind of socioeconomic tensions that have existed? Do we have people that really understand how to drive digital transformation when we've had to shift from a completely physical model to an online model almost overnight? And so you have actually seen a much greater, I think, awareness of the skill capabilities or not of some boards. And I think that is something that we are seeing people really having to, being open to different candidate profiles. I mean, the fundamentals of what makes a great board member, still need to be satisfied. But I think there's a recognition that is, there's a lot more that perhaps boards haven't been dealing with in the past that they probably should be. And that does create opportunities for people who come from those slightly more functional roles that you were talking about.
And Charlie, what I always find so interesting is I'm going to say, seeing progress in the boardroom in terms of diversity, and I think at a much faster pace generally than the C-suite, and certainly perhaps the most important seats in the C-suite. And I imagine some ways that's also a bit of a pipeline problem to get into the boardroom. If you're not seeing as much growth into, traditionally people have said the CEO and the CFO are the most important roles, and you need those on a board. You may just not need 5 of each of them on the board. So is part of this sort of a chicken egg thing, how you make one happen without the other?
I think I'm a sort of, and this goes a little bit to what I said earlier about building long-term relationships. I think a lot of our role is sometimes translating individuals to organisations and vice versa, in the sense of it's building out the understanding of why a particular functional expertise or capability can make someone a great board member. There's often a little bit of we have to get the organisation to kind of get their head around that, but we also need people from those functional roles to also start thinking about how do I position myself and my experience in a way that makes me a credible board member. So it's a little bit of continuing to make sure that we're building awareness on both sides and challenging each other to think of creative ways to ensure that everyone understands that you might want this different type of talent. They don't look and feel like someone that you've previously hired, but why they'd be a great contributor to the board.
And so, Charlie, help us imagine what it's like when you're having a conversation with a nominating governance committee and they're saying, we need a new board member, and he probably, looks, feels, and sounds like this. And they're probably leaning on your expertise of having recruited different people to maybe some of their competitors or other places in the industry. And you probably have a bit of an opportunity at the beginning to help shape, like, well, maybe we just need to find these certain skill sets. We shouldn't pre-imagine what that person is going to be when they come in. How does that actually look like before you actually go out and start finding the candidates?
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that we spend a lot of time with organisations is actually sort of, whether that's working with the chair or the nominating committee or the company secretary or whatever, is actually going, look, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the board, both now and in the future, and actually going to, and almost doing that mapping exercise. Because once you do it in that way and you depersonalise it, it creates much greater opportunity to then start saying, well, what kind of capabilities could we look to build in here? What kind of cultural add do we need, or that would benefit the organisation? And by approaching it that way, it does give us a bit more of an opportunity to then start saying, okay, well, if you think about just what kind of things would look great on the board, that becomes much less about do we need a former CEO? It becomes, we need someone with really strong digital capability, or we need someone who really understands the cultural change agenda. And then that can start shaping candidate profiles rather than looking at, we just need someone who's done something like this somewhere before. So in doing that, I kind of think that's our sort of best practice approach to then sort of opening up the discussion about, okay, what would great look like for your next board hire?
And maybe this begins to answer that long-age question when people were beginning to talk about how do we diversify in the boardroom. Said, well, we'd love to have female directors, but we can't find qualified candidates, or insert whatever type of person. We'd like to have them a candidate, but we can't find the qualified ones. I'm sure part of the answer is like, well, you call Egon Zehnder and they'll find the right person. But there's a little bit of some background that we need to get over across that point. Or is that something you guys go, no problem, we'll take that, we'll solve that, we're really good at that? How do you help organizations think about that?
The way we think about it is really focusing on the potential of the candidate. So if someone says to us, look, we want X and Y and they have to have this experience, a whole list of must-haves, that's where we have the bit of moment of truth conversation that says, well, on the one hand, you say you want to diversify and have a more inclusive board, but at the same time, the way you've written this role is it's only people who have ever done exactly what you've done will actually ever pass your kind of entry bar. So we will often sort of end up having a conversation about, look, you're better having less must-haves. You can have some nice-to-haves. But then you actually start having a conversation around, but let's go broad. Let's actually look for people that might hit some of your criteria, but not all of them. But then let's really dive deep on their potential to grow that capability or bring something different. And I suppose the other thing is we generally look to take quite a strong partnership approach. So part of that is not just saying, look, we'll go away and find you exactly what you want. It's going to be we're going to go on a bit of a journey with you to kind of find what good could look like in slightly different ways, and let's jointly commit to doing a search whereby you actually agree to interview some talent that doesn't necessarily tick all the boxes, but we think brings something else and might particularly support some of your more broader diversity ambitions. I think there's a slight there's a really interesting dynamic emerging at the moment of a lot of companies saying we demand particular diversity in our short lists or long lists. And that is, frankly, it's a little bit like targets. It's really having impact in terms of pushing things forward. But it's never going to achieve what it is hoping to if the organisations actually doing those board or executive hires don't equally commit to flexing their requirements to actually interviewing candidates that bring potential but maybe not all of the capabilities. So one of the things that's quite important early in the search process is to have some agreed terms of engagement around this. Like you are going to see, don't just shortlist the candidates that tick all of the boxes and ignore all of the ones that don't. You also need to, as an organisation, be open to challenging yourself. And so we'll often probe and push clients to meet that slightly off spec but interesting high potential talent that may bring something different.
And I imagine there are people listening to this episode going, okay, so I'm a first-time board member potential. Like, I'm excited about that. But there's this whole problem of how to get experience at a job, how to get a job that experience, sort of in the boardroom. We'd like someone who's been there and done it before. But especially as we start thinking about bringing more diversity in the boardroom, by definition, we will have more people that haven't been in that board space before. And I imagine there's a bit of a conundrum for some organizations going like, well, they might have made it on the candidate list, but they haven't checked that box. You're sort of getting to that. And I imagine part of that is also helping candidates be coached up and be ready to figure out how they add value to the boardroom and explain that during the interview process, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a couple of comments to make there. One of the great screening questions for a board process is actually asking someone, what do they think a great board director does and looks like? And a way for a candidate to really answer that well is to say that they've spent quite a bit of time talking with other directors and actually really understood what the role involves. Because that is a way of, yes, if you haven't had a role, you can at least show that you are thinking and acting like a good director. So I would just suggest that's one of the ways to demonstrate your awareness and understanding of what is involved. But it also shows that you've gone out there and been curious and tried to understand kind of what good looks like in your way. So I think that's probably a way to sort of enter the conversation if you don't already have the experience. So that's probably what I'd say on that point, Alexander.
Well, Charlie, from reading the report myself, there's some great information in there, wonderful statistics, good nuggets by people that are involved in the space, whether they're in the C-suite in the company and or on the board in leadership roles. And we appreciate the work that you guys are doing, raising awareness of this, both with organizations and at the candidates levels, and trying to advance people. At the end of the day, with the more diverse people and their skill sets and backgrounds we have in the boardroom, I think the better outcomes we will have for organizations. So that is a wonderful thing. Now, Charlie, we have to make sure we cover this point before we finish, because many people listening going, Charlie's exactly the kind of person I want to know. And so, not that we want to flood your LinkedIn inbox, but what is the right way generally? Would you teach people to think like, okay, I want to be known in executive search firms, I want to reach out, maybe finding the right person, of course, within the organization. What would that actually look and feel like to you as a recipient, to someone to say generally, like, this is the way you should go about building a relationship?
I think I would start with don't just think about the search firms as the way to enter the board world. I think part of it is ensuring that you're having the discussions that I just mentioned with other directors about not where you get a chance to share with them some of your experience, but then ask them, how did they go about becoming a director? What makes them a great director? Those kind of things, because that increases your network in a way that is additive to you, because you're actually asking the questions and getting an understanding. It also shows you're very curious about others, which is a nice way to get people invested in you. I think ensuring that your CV is kind of on the system of people such as Egon Zehnder, or firms such as Egon Zehnder, which we enable people to drop their CVs in, and that also helps because it comes into our database, so we will be looking. Don't hesitate to reach out to search firms. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but just don't be surprised if they say, thanks so much for being in touch. We'll certainly be in touch if anything relevant comes up. But I think fundamentally it goes back to having lots of conversations with people around what do they think a great board director is, and how did they make that pivot? The more the conversations you have, it means that as a search firm, when I call one of those people to say who's great out there, your name might get mentioned, but it also means that you're more likely to kind of be front of mind for others.
Well, Charlie, I know that you are playing a key role driving Egon Zehnder's efforts to increase both visible and non-visible diversity on boards. And at the heart of that, you're just trying to help senior leaders bring to life the significant leadership strengths that they bring to organizations that are linked to their diverse identity and experiences. And thank you for sharing the work that you personally are doing and what Egon Zehnder is doing in this space. And we're all headed in the right direction, but as we talked about today, more to do, right? So thank you for joining us on the show today, and we appreciate your insights in helping all of us to be boardroom bound. That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Charlie Beasley. It's always great to get someone who's willing to peel back the curtain, tell us what it's like to be an executive search person who's actually helping boards find the candidates and fills them in. And of course, Charlie is one of the leaders at Egon Zehnder in terms of board diversity and what that means. So it was wonderful to hear some of his insights from their 2020 Global Board Diversity Tracker titled Who's Really on Board? And of course, this year it tells us so much more than their past versions over the last 16 years. So this biennial one not only talks about diversity, but racial, ethnic, sexual orientation. These are conversations that the board is having, thinking about how do we find the right candidates? How do we open the doors to get people with the right skill sets to come in? And we appreciate Charlie also doing that, telling us a lot more stories and what it feels like to be that person who is helping find the right candidates for the organization. And remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll find links to all of today's resources, including this survey results. Know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.